In this video, I'm going to show you how to make a Valtos vest. The pattern for the vest is available to purchase from the website or the Etsy shop. So step 1 is to cut all the various pieces of your fabric, and step 2 is to make the collar. So you take your 2 pieces of collar and your piece of interfacing, and you iron the interfacing onto the wrong side of one of the pieces of collar. Then you're going to take your 2 pieces of collar and put them right sides together, and you're going to pin them and sew all around the outside edge of the collar. Then you might want to trim the corners and clip your curves. This just makes it easier to turn the collar right side out, and a chopstick is often useful to push out the corners. And now you've got your collar turned nice right side out, give it a good press and it's ready to use. And on to step 3, which is optional. If you want pockets, now is the time to make them. Cut out your pocket pieces and put them right sides together and sew around the outside, leaving a gap at the bottom. About 5 centimetres for smaller pockets and about 10 centimetres if you're putting much larger pockets on your vest. Now trim your corners and turn the pockets right side out. Again, a chopstick is good for pushing out those corners. At the bottom of the pocket, fold in the seam allowance, and then you're going to press it so that when you sew the pocket onto the front of the vest, you're going to sew that gap closed. And then give the pockets a really good press so they're ready to sew onto the front of the vest a little bit later. And it's on to step 4, which is optional, and you only need to do this if you want a zip instead of a button or a snap closure. Take your zip and unzip it and turn it to the wrong side. So you want to make sure that it lines up exactly with the top of your neckline. Then take the other side of the zip and again flip it over so right hand sides are together and pin it or clip it, making sure that both sides of the zip are lined up exactly at the top. Now we're going to baste stitch, which just means stitch but use a really long stitch, just to hold everything together in the right place. I like to use a zipper foot, but you don't have to. But if you do use a zipper foot, it should line up with the edge of your fabric and zip. And then sew all the way down. And then do the same on the other side of your vest. And it's on to step 5, which is to sew the shoulder and the side seams of your outer fabric and your lining. So on screen just now, I'm sewing the shoulder seams and the sides of the outer fabric. And then I'm doing the same for the lining, but with the lining, one of your sides, you have to remember to leave a 6-inch or about 15 centimetre gap so that you can turn the vest later on. And then leaving that gap, and you're going to want to press all your seams open so that the vest sits flat nicely at the seams. And now we have step 6, which is optional. You only need to do this if you have pockets, and you're going to attach the pockets to the front of your main fabric. And do try and position them carefully, nice straight, and wherever you want the pockets to go. And then you want to top sew the 3 sides of the pocket. And step 7, now you want to attach your collar to the main fabric, and we're going to do that by baste stitching the collar onto the neckline. Baste stitching just means using a long stitch. So this bit's really important. You must find the very centre of your collar, and then you want to pin it with both right sides facing up. Pin it to the very centre of the back of your vest. It is important because if you don't do this, the collar's going to be wonky at the front. So yeah, match up your centre back with the centre back of your collar. And then you're going to pin that collar to the neckline of your vest, working from the back outwards on either side. Then you want to take that over to your sewing machine and again start from the centre back and work outwards, baste stitching that collar onto your vest. Just to confirm again, your collar and your main fabric are both going to be right sides up. And before you do the next step, I would recommend you tuck in the corners of your collar so you don't stitch them by mistake when you're stitching all round the vest in the next step, which is step number 8. We're going to sew the fabric and the lining together with the collar sandwiched inside. So it's going to be the main fabric and your lining, both right sides together with the collar sandwiched inside. And as you can see, I'm just pinning all around the edges of the vest. It can get quite thick at your joins with the lining, but just persevere and try to get them as flat as possible so you can sew right over them. And if you have a zip, then your zip is also again going to be sandwiched inside between the main fabric and the lining. So you've got to match up the edge of the lining to the edge of your main fabric and your zip, so it's all lined up along the same line. So at this point I would pin underneath at the bottom of the armholes, I would pin each side together so that you know that's going to line up nicely, and then you want to pin along the bottom of the fabric to join it all together. This bit of the video is actually a bit deceptive because that bottom line of the lining and the main fabric actually do join up. It's just there was a bit of overhang with the wadding from the fabric on the side, but it should all line up. Now you want to sew all around the vest and the outside, so you don't sew the armholes. We don't have anything to do with the armholes at the moment, and you want to sew all around the outside. And then I would trim any excess fabric, trim your corners, trim anything that's particularly bulky, any bits of particularly thick pieces of seam allowance, and then you might want to clip your neckline. Now you want to find that gap in the lining and you're going to turn the vest right side out. And turn the vest right side out through that side hole. It can be a bit tricky, but do persevere and you'll get there eventually. It can look a bit of a mess at first, but by the time you sort of straighten everything out, push out all the corners, give it a press, and it does start to resemble your vest. And on to step 9, which is where you add bias binding to your armholes. So pin or clip the armhole to keep it all together. You might want to trim some of your armhole first, just to make sure that it all lines up. And then we're going to be pinning or clipping all around the armhole, and then you can base stitch it if you like, and that's just stitching around the outside with a very long stitch just to hold it all together while you add your bias binding. Now there are lots of ways to add bias bindings to armholes, and you might want to do a YouTube search, and there's other ways. This is not necessarily the best way, it's just the way I like to do it. So I leave about 3 inches, 8 centimetres of binding at the end before I start sewing, and you're sewing the binding with right sides together, and you're sewing down that first groove in the binding all around the armhole. And then I stop 3 inches, about 8 centimetres from where I started. And then you want to sort of pull out the ends of the bias binding and sew right across the bias binding, and it's 1.5 inches, 4 centimetres away from where the sewing stopped. So you might want to, if you buy the pattern and read the instructions, you might want to read that several times and look at the still photographs. We're essentially joining those ends together, and then you want to press open the seam allowance of the binding, and then you're going to sew down that first groove again, and that's going to close that gap. And like I say, there are lots of different ways of attaching the bias binding to your armhole. So I'll watch of various people doing it on Instagram or YouTube and find the method that you like the best. And then so you want to turn the binding over onto the inside of your vest, and you want to pin or clip the binding so that it covers that first line of stitching. And then if you turn back to the right side of your vest, and this is where you're now ready to top sew in the groove, sometimes known as stitch in the ditch, which is just stitching at that join between the bias binding and your vest. And what that should do is then just catch the bias binding on the inside of the vest. And it can be quite tricky, particularly sewing at the bottom of the armhole and making sure that you always catch the inside of the bias binding. So sometimes if I want a nice high-end finish, I do hand sew the inside of the bias binding onto the lining, so the stitches are almost invisible. And then step 10 is to sew the gap in the lining closed. And ta-da, that's it. The version I've made on the video has a zip, but the pattern does allow for cutting it so that you can have a button enclosure or a snaps enclosure, and the only difference is that at the end of the process you do the buttonholes and sew on the buttons, or you attach the snaps. Thank you for watching, and if there was something interesting in there for you, I'd be very grateful if you could hit the subscribe button. And if you do Instagram, it's at Greyfriars and Grace, and a follow would be really much appreciated. Thank you for watching, and happy sewing!